The fluorescent lights in the parking garage buzzed overhead, a constant electrical hum that had become the soundtrack to Maya's life. She stood in her booth, the small glass enclosure that smelled perpetually of stale coffee, and the exhaust fumes that never quite cleared from the concrete structure. Her polyester uniform shirt stuck to her back, despite the October chill that crept through the open levels, and her feet ached in the non-slip shoes required by her employer. She'd been standing for 6 hours already, with 2 more to go before her shift ended, and she could drag herself to her second job at the diner 3 blocks away. The parking garage served the medical district, a constant stream of anxious families and hurried professionals flowing through its levels. Maya had learned to read people in the 3 months since she'd taken this job, the desperate ones who circled endlessly, looking for spots close to the entrance, the entitled ones who double-parked and threw money at her expecting exceptions, the exhausted ones who'd been here too many times before. She processed them all with mechanical efficiency, her mind usually elsewhere, calculating how many more shifts until her next student loan payment was due, how many more years until the crushing debt that had come with her unfinished nursing degree might actually disappear. A black SUV pulled up to her booth, its engine a low purr that spoke of money, of a world Maya only saw from the outside. The vehicle was pristine despite the city streets, its windows tinted so dark she couldn't see inside. She straightened automatically, reaching for the ticket machine, when the back window lowered with a whisper of expensive mechanics. The woman in the back seat was beautiful in a way that made Maya's breath catch. Dark hair swept into an elegant twist, skin that glowed with the kind of health that came from never worrying about money, eyes that were kind despite the obvious exhaustion in them. But it was the swell of her belly, prominent even through her designer dress, that made Maya's professional assessment shift immediately. The woman was heavily pregnant, her hand resting protectively on her stomach, her face tight with discomfort. "I'm sorry," the woman said, her voice carrying an accent that might have been Italian, softened by years in America. "Is there anything close to the entrance? I have an appointment, and—" She gestured at her belly with a small, rueful smile. Maya glanced at her monitor. The garage was nearly full, as it always was on weekday afternoons. The few remaining spots were on the upper levels, a long walk even for someone who wasn't 8 months pregnant. She thought of the reserved spot near the elevator on the ground level, the one kept empty for the parking company's regional manager who rarely visited. She thought of the write-up she'd get if anyone found out she'd given it away. She thought of this woman climbing stairs in her condition. "Level 1, spot A7, right next to the elevator," Maya said, overriding the system and printing a ticket with the premium location. "It's marked reserved, but don't worry about it. Just show them this ticket if anyone asks." The woman's expression transformed, relief washing over her features so completely that Maya felt the decision settle right in her chest despite the risk. "Thank you," the woman said, and there was something more than gratitude in her voice. Recognition, maybe, of one woman helping another in a world that didn't always make space for kindness. "Thank you so much." The driver, a man with shoulders like a linebacker and a scar that ran down his jaw, handed Maya a $100 bill. She started to make change, but the woman shook her head. "Please, you've done more for me today than you know." The SUV pulled forward before Maya could protest, disappearing into the garage's depths. She held the $100 bill in her hand, crisp and new, and for a moment let herself imagine what it might buy. Groceries for 2 weeks, maybe, or a payment on the credit card she'd maxed out when her car broke down last month. Then she folded it carefully and tucked it into her pocket, trying not to think about how such a small thing could matter so much. The rest of her shift passed in the usual blur of tickets and payments, and the occasional argument with someone who insisted they'd only been parked for an hour when her system clearly showed 3. The sun set beyond the open walls of the garage, the city lights beginning their nightly glitter, and Maya felt the familiar weight of exhaustion settling into her bones. When her replacement finally arrived, 15 minutes late as usual. She grabbed her jacket and headed for the employee exit, her mind already on the diner shift ahead. She was halfway across the ground level when she saw the SUV still parked in spot A7. The woman sat in the back seat, her face visible now through the open door, talking on the phone while the driver stood nearby. Maya hesitated, then continued walking. It wasn't her business, and she was already late, but something made her glance back, some instinct she developed from years of paying attention to the wrong details at the wrong times. The man who appeared from the elevator bank was dressed in a suit that probably cost more than Maya made in 3 months. He moved with the kind of confidence that comes from never being told no, his dark hair swept back from a face that was striking in its sharp angles and harder edges. 2 other men flanked him, both built like her garage's concrete pillars, both watching everything with eyes that never stopped moving. Maya recognized power when she saw it, recognized danger in the way other people in the garage seemed to unconsciously shift away from the group's path. The man reached the SUV, and his entire demeanor changed. The hardness in his face softened as he looked at the pregnant woman, his hand coming up to cup her cheek with a gentleness that seemed impossible from someone who radiated such controlled violence. Maya couldn't hear what they said, but she saw the woman gesture toward the garage entrance, saw her smile, saw the man's head turn toward Maya's booth. Then his eyes found Maya across the parking level, and she froze. She'd been noticed by men before, at the diner, on the street, in the college classes she'd had to drop when the money ran out. She'd learned to make herself invisible, to deflect attention, to keep her head down and move through the world without creating ripples. But this man's gaze was different. It wasn't predatory, wasn't assessing her body or dismissing her existence. It was simply aware, completely focused, seeing her in a way that made her feel exposed, despite standing in a public garage with dozens of people around. He said something to the woman, who looked toward Maya and smiled. Then he was walking toward her, his security detail maintaining their distance but staying alert, and Maya's heart began to hammer against her ribs. Every instinct she'd developed from years of surviving in a city that could be cruel told her to run. But her feet stayed planted, her pride refusing to let her flee from something as simple as a conversation. "You're the parking attendant who helped my wife," he said when he reached her. It wasn't a question. His voice was deep, carrying an accent that matched his wife's, but stronger, less softened by time. Up close, she could see the gray threaded through his dark hair, the lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting at threats. He was perhaps 40, maybe 45, holding on to the prime of his life with the kind of discipline that came from controlling everything around him. "I just gave her a good spot," Maya said, forcing her voice to stay steady. She looked uncomfortable. "She has 2 more weeks until the baby comes." Something flickered in his expression. Concern, tenderness, fear perhaps. "The doctors want to see her twice a week now. She hates it. Hates being treated like she's fragile." Maya didn't know why he was telling her this, didn't understand what he wanted. She shifted her weight, aware of the time ticking away, aware of her manager at the diner who would dock her pay if she was late. "I'm glad I could help, but I really need to—" "What's your name?" he asked. And it was absolutely a question this time, though phrased like something he expected answered. She should have lied, should have given him something fake, should have protected herself from whatever this was. But there was something in his eyes that made dishonesty feel impossible, something that suggested he'd know, and the lie would matter more than the truth. "Maya Reyes." He nodded slowly, as if she'd confirmed something he'd already known. "I'm Luca Moretti." He said it like she should recognize the name, and maybe she should have. But Maya didn't follow news about the city's power players, didn't have time to care about the wealthy families who controlled things from their penthouses and private clubs. "You did my family a kindness today. I don't forget things like that." "It was just a parking spot," Maya said, uncomfortable with the weight he was giving her small gesture. "Really, it was nothing." "Nothing," he repeated, and there was something almost amused in his tone, though his expression didn't change. You broke your employer's rules. You gave away something valuable. You asked nothing in return. And you call it nothing. Heat crept up Maya's neck. When he put it that way, it sounded significant, sounded like a choice that mattered. But she'd been making choices like that her whole life, giving the last of her tips to the single mother at the table next to her, volunteering at the shelter even when she was exhausted, sending money to her younger brother for his textbooks when she could barely afford her own rent. The world was hard enough without adding to its cruelty. I need to go, she said, because this conversation felt like it was heading somewhere she couldn't afford to follow. I'm late for my other job. Luca Moretti's eyes sharpened on that detail, reading something in her words that she hadn't meant to reveal. Other job? How many do you work? That's not really your business, Maya said, and then froze, because that was exactly the kind of thing you didn't say to men who looked like they owned half the city. But he didn't react with anger, didn't show offense. If anything, that almost amusement deepened. No, he agreed. It's not. He reached into his jacket, and Maya's heart stuttered because she'd seen enough movies to know what came next. But instead of a weapon, he pulled out a card, thick paper with embossed lettering that caught the fluorescent light. If you ever need anything, call this number. Maya took the card automatically, looking down at the simple black text. A name, a phone number, nothing else. No company, no title, no explanation. I don't need anything, she said, which was such an enormous lie that she almost laughed. She needed everything: money, time, hope, a future that didn't involve working herself to death for scraps. Everyone needs something, Luca said quietly. And I pay my debts. He turned to leave, then paused, glancing back at her. Be careful getting home, Maya Reyes. This city isn't always kind to people who work late. Then he was walking back to his wife and the SUV, his security detail falling into formation around him, and Maya was left standing in the middle of the parking garage with a business card in her hand and the feeling that her life had just tilted sideways without her permission. She made it to the diner 17 minutes late. Her manager, a perpetually angry man named Curtis, who seemed to take personal offense at her existence, docked her pay and assigned her the worst section, the counter seats where drunk college students tipped in loose change, and people camped for hours over a single coffee. Maya put on her apron, pasted on the smile that never reached her eyes, and tried to forget about Luca Moretti and his pregnant wife, and the strange weight of debt he claimed to owe her. But she kept the card. 3 days passed before Maya thought about the card again. 3 days of parking tickets and rude customers, and tips that barely covered her gas to get between jobs. 3 days of her apartment's heater breaking down as November arrived with cruel cold. 3 days of showering at the gym because the hot water was tied to the heating system. 3 days of wearing all her clothes to bed and still shivering through the nights. On the 4th day, she came home to an eviction notice. It was taped to her door, the bright orange paper impossible to miss, official and merciless in its language. She had 7 days to pay 3 months' back rent or vacate the premises. Maya stood in the hallway of her rundown building, the notice in her trembling hands, and tried to understand how she'd miscounted so badly. She'd thought she had 2 months before they could evict, thought she had time to figure something out, thought she could pick up extra shifts and make enough to at least negotiate. 7 days. She let herself into the apartment. Studio, really, barely 200 square feet that smelled like mold, and the Chinese restaurant below. It was cold inside, cold enough to see her breath, and all her possessions looked suddenly pathetic in the dying light through the single window. The futon she'd bought secondhand, the milk crates serving as shelves, the hot plate she used because the stove didn't work, the textbooks from her abandoned degree that she'd kept because selling them would feel like admitting defeat. Maya sat down on the futon and pulled out her phone. She opened her bank app, though she knew what it would show: $47.16. She opened her credit card app. though she knew what it would show. Maxed out. The minimum payment due in 6 days. She opened her student loan portal, though she knew what it would show. $73,000 of debt. Payments she'd been deferring for months now. Interest compounding daily into an amount she would never, ever be able to repay. The card was still in her wallet. She'd looked at it exactly once since Luca Moretti had given it to her, had run her thumb over the embossed letters, and told herself she would never call. Men like that didn't give something for nothing. Men like that didn't help without expecting something in return. She'd been 23 years old when she'd learned that lesson the hard way, when the professor who'd promised to help with her financial aid had suggested other ways she might earn his assistance. She'd walked out of his office and out of nursing school the same day, and she'd never once regretted choosing her dignity over her degree. But dignity didn't keep you warm. Dignity didn't keep a roof over your head. Maya pulled out the card, staring at the phone number. She thought about the way Luca Moretti had looked at his pregnant wife, the tenderness in his expression that had seemed so at odds with everything else about him. She thought about his wife's gratitude, genuine and warm. She thought about him saying he paid his debts, like it was a law of nature rather than a choice. She could call, she could ask for help. She could accept whatever strings came attached and deal with the consequences later, because at least she'd have somewhere to sleep while she dealt with them. Or she could figure this out herself, the way she'd figured out everything else in her 27 years of life. Maya put the card back in her wallet and pulled out her laptop. There had to be something she could do, another job she could take, something she could sell, somewhere cheaper she could move, even if cheaper meant dangerous. She opened classified sites and job boards, scrolling through options with increasing desperation. Most required experience she didn't have, offered wages that wouldn't cover her expenses, demanded availability during hours when she was already working. Her phone rang. The number was unknown, but Maya answered anyway, because unknown numbers might be bill collectors, but might also be job opportunities. Hello? Ms. Reyes? The voice was male, professional, unfamiliar. My name is David Chen. I'm calling on behalf of Luca Moretti. Maya's fingers tightened on the phone. I haven't called him. No, Chen agreed. He's calling you. Or rather, I'm calling on his behalf. He'd like to meet with you tomorrow to discuss a business proposition. I'm not interested in... It's a job offer, Chen interrupted smoothly. Legitimate employment with competitive salary and benefits. Mr. Moretti was impressed by your actions at the parking garage and believes you'd be an excellent fit for a position in his organization. Maya's laugh was harsh, even to her own ears. His organization? You mean his criminal organization? There was a brief pause. I mean his business interests, which are extensive and varied. But I understand your hesitation. Perhaps we could meet somewhere public. There's a coffee shop on 3rd Avenue, Rosa's. Tomorrow at 10 a.m.? You can hear the details and decide for yourself. I work at 10 a.m. Mr. Moretti will compensate you for any wages lost. Of course he would. Because men like Luca Moretti could simply erase inconveniences with money, could rearrange the world to suit their schedules. Maya should have said no, should have hung up, should have blocked the number and thrown away the card and forgotten that any of this had ever happened. Fine, she heard herself say. 10 a.m. at Rosa's. Chen thanked her and ended the call, leaving Maya staring at her phone and wondering which version of herself she'd just betrayed.